Welcome to the Aspen Institute's Hearst Lecture Series event on the future of higher education, how research universities are responding to COVID-19. I'm Crystal Logan, the Aspen Institute's Vice President for Aspen Community Programs and Engagement. And I want to first thank Bob and Soledad Hearst for making this series possible. Thanks to our panelists for joining today. And finally, thanks to our audience for tuning in for this important conversation. There are links to the panelists' bios in the chat feature on your screen. Please monitor the chat for important information throughout the event. And if you have a question for any of the panelists, please type those into the Q&A feature during the event. We're thrilled and honored to feature this panel of leaders today. Dr. Julio Frenk is the president of the University of Miami, and he also served as the Minister of Health for Mexico for 6 years. Dr. Kristina Johnson, Chancellor of the State University of New York, also served as U.S. Undersecretary of Energy. Janet Napolitano is the president of the University of California and served as the U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security and as Governor of Arizona. And our moderator today is Dr. Dan Porterfield, President and CEO of the Aspen Institute. He comes to us from leadership positions in higher education at Franklin and Marshall College and Georgetown University. Everyone on this panel is a giant in their field, and we look forward to learning from them. Over to you, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. And thank you, Julio, Janet, and Kristina for being here today, and to all of our attendees and to the Hearst family, which supports this spectacular lecture series. If we just counted the number of alums of your three institutions, I think we get above 3 million. If we just counted the number of faculty at your institutions, I think we might get close to 400,000, maybe more. If we counted the discoveries that the researchers have made at your institutions and their impact upon humanity, it would probably touch every person on the planet. These are three of the most important institutions in our country, and we have three leaders that are extraordinary for their ability to focus on leading institutions that are complex, highly impactful, messy at times, and absolutely essential to the public good. And so let's jump right in with the questions I'll ask will be about medical centers at this moment and public health programs, research and why it matters at this time, how you're thinking about the opening of your campuses and the pivot that you've made to virtual learning, what it's like to lead a people-serving institution of this size and scope in a time of such great complexity and human need. And first, if I may, the whole country has been rocked since the killing of George Floyd with the awareness that structural and interpersonal racism exists in so many different ways in our society, in our communities, in our workplaces, in our families. And we've all, as a country, been having a reckoning about what more can we do to lean into and live the ideals of our country. Each of you are leaders in this work. And I might ask if you would just comment briefly about this moment of reckoning in your academic communities and what you're learning as you listen to people. I'm not sure how to call on you, so I'm just going to take the moderator's prerogative of just picking you, and I'll just rotate. So perhaps we could start with Chancellor Johnson.
Thank you very much, Dan, and it's a pleasure and honor to be on this panel with President Napolitano and, of course, with President Frenk. The very difficult time, the brutal killing of George Floyd really laid bare the deep-seated cultural inequalities in this country. And higher education is no stranger to that either. And I think that we think about our Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the force of law is still maliciously and disproportionately applied to people who are Black, brown, LGBTQ. And, you know, this injustice is intolerable. So, and it compounds the anguish of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we need to root out the racism, and that's on us. When I think about some of the things that we're trying to do within SUNY, there's still a lot more to do. One of the first things that I noticed when I became chancellor 3 years ago was that although the demographics of our students were between 25 and 30% underrepresented minority, our professoriate was only 9%. So my view is if you see it, you can be it. But if you can't see it in the classroom, if the people that are teaching our next generation don't look like them, then I think we failed. So we put in place a program called Prodigy, which is promoting the recruitment, retention, opportunities for inclusive growth with the goal of hiring 1,000 underrepresented minority faculty and women in STEM over the next decade. So we started that, this is our 2nd year. And with the goal that we can diversify the professoriate, but that's just the beginning. We still need to diversify our staff, our academic leadership. So this is going to take time. It's going to take every single one of us. And I think that that's the moment that we all realize, yes, there is racism. It needs to be rooted out. I think we've known that before, but we need to act and we need to do it now.
Yep. Thank you, Chancellor Johnson. President Frenk, how are you thinking about this today?
You know, I always think of universities as boundary spanning institutions. We are a community. Of course, as a private university, we're much smaller than either of the systems that President Napolitano and Chancellor Johnson represent. But it is a community of students, faculty, staff. On the other hand, we are outward facing. We provide a vital service to both by education, research, and healthcare, mostly as our main form of service to communities. And in this particular case, if you look at what we provide to the larger society, first of all, universities have a crucial role in illuminating the causes of structural racism, the persistence of those practices linked to abuses of power by law enforcement. Those are topics that are intrinsically complex. And one of our fundamental duties is through scholarship and research to illuminate that conversation, that societal conversation, and provide that guidance at this time. But at the same time, we need internally to serve as a model in our own internal community for the larger society. I like to think of universities as exemplary institutions. It's a very old idea. Universities as providing an example to the larger society of which they're part in the values they espouse and the behaviors they exhibit. And therefore, as Chancellor Johnson was saying, we are also embarking we have embarked in very specific goals of not just embracing diversity, but also very specifically, in our case in Miami, the big challenge is our Black faculty and Black students. Hispanics are not an issue. I myself, as president, identify as such, but being very focused around creating not just diversity by numbers, but really developing a culture of belonging where everyone feels value and everyone has the opportunity to add value in our internal community. And that is another very important aspect of what we do, serve as that model or example to the larger society of which we are a part.
Thank you, President Frenk. President Napolitano?
Well, I think we have to begin by not letting ourselves forget that 8 minutes and 46 seconds that we saw on video. So powerful and such a demonstration of not only a murder being committed before our very eyes, but a murder being committed by someone who was privileged to wear a badge and carry a gun, and raising issues about structural racism in many, many elements of our society. And as universities, we have a key responsibility here. We have the responsibility for doing the research and helping to illuminate, as President Frenk just said, the causes and the historical context and the social implications of the structural racism that we're experiencing. We have to reform ourselves with intentionality and persistence and consistency. And that means our student bodies, but also importantly, our professoriate, as President Johnson said, they're doing at SUNY. We ourselves are doing at the University of California. We need to serve as examples that can be replicated. For example, we have our own police departments. We need to make sure that our police departments are 21st century police departments, and that they are built upon having a culture of safety and partnership, and not an us versus them dynamic. And so we're going back in. We had a task force on policing just a year ago. We're going back in to see what more it is we should do with respect to our own policing activities. There's so much that we should as a country do in this area, and we should not let it go by without endeavoring to accomplish major reform. Let's not let this be an episode, but let it be an inflection point.
Well, each of you is striving to create that exemplary community that President Frenk spoke of, and there's so much to it when you're running an institution of the size and complexity of yours. Let's make a pivot now to one part of the mission, which is to have an academic health center or a medical center where you're providing on the ground immediate responses to urgent needs in this era of COVID-19. I'd like to get to the research in a moment, but let me just ask, what is it like to be responsible for medical institutions during the middle of this pandemic? Maybe Julio, I go to you first.
Sure. Well, I've been living this because when we were bracing for the surge in demand that we were expecting, and as we were, of course, Florida came later after California and after New York, and we very much wanted to avoid any situation of our academic health system becoming overwhelmed. We are the sole academic health system in South Florida. We provide that cutting edge, most specialized care, which is absolutely critical in a complex disease like COVID-19. So the board actually asked me to step in as interim CEO of our academic health system. So for these 3 months, I have been performing the dual role of being president of the entire university, but also being the CEO of the academic health system, because that happens to be my professional training is as a physician and then someone who specialized in global public health. This is the 5th pandemic I have had. I wouldn't call it the privilege, but the experience of being in a decision-making position. So I've been looking at that very closely at the operational level. And we were very mindful of the need to get ahead of the game. I mean, this is, by definition, every time there's a new pathogen, what defines the emergency is uncertainty. This is the first time humans are interacting with this particular virus. So we are learning as we go. And that requires a mindset in which you are contemplating every possible scenario, including the worst case scenario, and getting ready for those. It's not preparing for the best and hoping for the worst and hoping for the best. It's preparing for the worst and working for the best. And that's what we did. We got ahead in terms of procurement, of making sure we expanded intensive care, procurement of ventilators, all of that. and then being ready there as the pinnacle of the medical referral system for the most acute and complicated cases. And so far, we've been able to do so without being overwhelmed. But it's not over, and we continue to be on that process of always trying to stay one step ahead of the pandemic.
Yeah, and how is Julio? How's the morale of all of your colleagues working on the front lines?
It's good. I think because we were very mindful about the need to provide personal protective equipment and send a very clear signal that the safety of our frontline health providers is absolute priority. We haven't had many incidents there, and the morale is good. I think this is where the best of the way we educate doctors, nurses, and other health professionals in an ethic of service. This is where it comes to the forefront. Yeah. So the morale is good.
Yeah. Kristina, has it been like to do this in the context of New York State, which was one of the places where it hit earliest and hardest?
Well, I was amazed, Dr. Frenk, I didn't know your background. I think that's awesome that you stepped in as also interim CEO. I can't imagine that running the university. So hats off to you. I think one of the interesting things about the State University of New York is so we have 5 medical centers and we have 3 hospital systems. And they're geographically spread out. So that really helped us because we have a medical center, Excellent One, up in Buffalo, then in Syracuse. And then we have 3 that are actually we're in the epicenter. So those would be located in Brooklyn and Manhattan. So New York City, obviously, and then Long Island. So that really helped us because as we were starting to see the surge in Long Island and New York City, the other medical systems helped out. So they helped out because we worked together to collaborate around research and antivirals and vaccines. We looked to provide personnel and PPE. I think one of the most moving things that I've seen, and you may have seen it on national TV, was when it really hit Stony Brook University Hospital and also Downstate Health Sciences University Hospital. So just to give you a level set, UHB, University Hospital, Brooklyn, about 83% Medicaid and Medicare. So they really are caring for the most needy in their communities. And they're just slammed. I mean, it really hit hard. And so they didn't have the nursing staff. They didn't have the respiratory techs, the pharmacy techs. So the Upstate Medical University provided somewhere about 50 personnel that volunteered to leave the safety of their homes and travel downstate, as we call it, and to help out with Stony Brook and also downstate. So couldn't be more proud of those individuals that helped. It also, some of the other campuses, even though they weren't medical centers, because they had football fields, we actually built a temporary medical facility at Old Westbury College and another one at Stony Brook University. So it was interesting to see from a system perspective, and I'm sure President Napolitano feels the same way, how a system responds to something of this size, scale, and scope. So we had the facilities. Actually, the State University of New York, SUNY owns and operates 40% of the state buildings. So we had enormous physical stock. We actually had 80,000 students leave dorms, and that freed up dorms in Manhattan at the Aspen Institute Technology. They freed up a dorm to house first responders and people that were building some of these temporary medical centers. So it was all the pieces that kind of worked together between the research and the facilities, the innovative products and processes and PPE. Even Aspen Institute Technology and alumni started a company, a not-for-profit, of course, called Sewing for Lives. And altogether, they produced about 55,000 facial shields and facial coverings. So I couldn't have been more proud of the 90,000 employees and the 30,000 faculty that really pulled together to help in this fight.
Well, and there's been such leadership in New York in sustaining the improvements. I hope that you can't take it for granted, but I hope it gives you a feeling of pride to be a part of it. And what has it been like to work with Governor Cuomo, who's had quite a lot of national visibility for his hands-on approach?
You know, what a leader. thoughtful, caring, appropriately aggressive, and a very terrific communicator. I mean, we're all a little bit in withdrawal, I would say, because we look forward to the daily briefings, because it was just someone that had such a gift to be able to communicate in a very calm, caring, thoughtful manner what needed to be done. And so we worked very closely with the governor's office, Governor Cuomo, Department of Health, because in the process, and I'm sure, you know, President Frenk and President Napolitano went through the same procedure, but we formed a task force and 7 working groups, and each campus then reflected that. We've developed 64 plans for the different colleges that are geographically dispersed throughout the state. So they have a different risk profile in order to get ready for what we'll do come fall of 2020. Couldn't have done that without the leadership of Governor Cuomo.
Yeah, extraordinary. So Janet, you've had lots of experience as a governor, as a head of Homeland Security, and as the president of this enormous education system. Let's start with what the Cal system has done. What's it been like sitting in your seat with medical centers all across the state trying to save lives?
Right. So we have medical centers from San Diego to Davis. They quickly converted to being COVID-19 hospitals, essentially, and have been providing that care. We like both President Frenk and President Johnson have a large percentage of Medi-Cal patients who are in our hospital system. So providing care for them has been a privilege. We've been coordinating with the state with respect to overall state public health guidance. You know, when you ask President Frenk about morale, I would say that one of the great things that it's been for me to observe is how the physicians and nurses and respiratory therapists, but also the folks who provide food service and custodial service at our hospitals all really leaned forward into this need to provide care for the pandemic. And beyond California, UCSF sent a large team to Queens in New York to help there, and also to the Navajo Nation, which was also sorely afflicted by the virus. You know, now California is surging again. Our caseloads are approaching really what they were in March. I think the governor is going to be reluctant to have another statewide shutdown order, but I believe he's going to have to slow down the process of reopening. You know, we are prepared again to be COVID-19 hospitals. That's what we need to do. You know, one thing I would, from a management standpoint, I would have to mention is by turning ourselves into COVID-19 hospitals, we actually lost a lot of money. In fact, the revenue loss to the University of California through the end of May from our hospitals is around $800 million. Not a small sum, because of the need to postpone or cancel other procedures that would otherwise be done in our hospitals. And so when we think about federal funding and federal support, one of the things we need particular attention paid for is to help with these academic medical centers, because they really did take a leadership role in providing care here.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You. Exactly. And we've seen that across the country. Janet, one quick follow-up. You were Homeland Secretary during H1N1, and you have dealt with pandemics and crises of many types. And looking ahead, what would you want for our federal government's role for the next one of these? that we get? Is there, go ahead.
I'd want the federal government to be quicker to the ball. I'd want them to be better organized. I'd want them to communicate clearly and consistently with information that the people of the country need in order to empower themselves. They need to have information to know how best to protect themselves, how best to protect their communities. We need the federal government to help with some of the procurement issues for the basic necessities of providing care. I'm not shy in saying that I think the federal government, this administration was slow to the ball and is still not providing kind of the adequate overall framework and structure for things like testing that you really need to have for effective pandemic response.
Yep. I think one of the things on everybody's mind is that as the virus gains strength in some parts of the country and the world, it imperils all parts of the country and all parts of the world.
Right.
We really are in a global struggle here.
Right.
And one of the tools in our arsenal is research. And each of your institutions is a jewel in employing faculty and researchers who are working on basic science research or on the cutting edge of applied research in all ways, in all fields. And I think that's less understood maybe in the country than the teaching mission of our great universities.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I would ask maybe each of you to comment about something about the research mission of your institution that you feel is highly relevant to the circumstances that we're in today, something that you're proud of and advocating for, so that we can build more support for the research function of our great institutions. I'll go to Chancellor Johnson first.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think several things that SUNY has in our area leading, and that's both at University of Buffalo and also at University of Albany. So in partnership with Northwell Health with University of Albany and then University of Buffalo, both of them have established institutes for healthcare disparities. And so one of the things that they're looking at and studying is how, this is for individuals, underserved communities that already have more comorbidities than maybe the average population. This is hitting particularly hard. So I think that they're in a unique position to study and figure out how do we better address it. So that's one area I'm very proud of. I think the other area that came together is at Upstate Medical University. We have some researchers that were working on batch testing or pool testing. So you can make things one at a time. You can test people one at a time. Or if you have the right test, you could actually pool the called saliva, if you will, from say 20 or 25 people in order to do what's called find the needle in the haystack. So if you think about bringing back 400,000 students in the fall, and you want to be able to screen, test, trace, and treat 1%, 0.1% of the population that may be infected. So it's really important that you have 0 false negatives because you have to find them, but you also don't want to have false positives because then that inundates the system. So that's another area where Upstate Medical University and some of our researchers have taken a lead, and they actually have within at the FDA a emergency use authorization for a particular test that is very good at doing this sort of pool or batch testing. It's that ability, and I think this is something that that President Napolitano, I know you're passionate about, I'm sure you are too, President Frenk, which is the ability, since we're a nonprofit, to bring people together focused on a common problem that's important to society and solve it. And so that sort of convergent research, I think, is really done well at the research institutions. It may be the one place where, you're able to galvanize a system, including private and public partnerships, to go after a problem that's very, very important. So I think that's the one thing I would say we're all very good at and should be proud of.
Yeah, thank you. President Frenk, your thoughts on this, on the research mission?
I mean, I have no doubt that it's research that's going to get us to the other side of this pandemic. It is the key. And, you know, one interesting side effect is at a time when we were listening to politicians all over the world, I mean, with this rise of populism around the world, question the value of experts, we find ourselves in a moment when society is clamoring for the opinion of experts. I mean, there's so much uncertainty because that defines every time there's a new pathogen, that part of the anxiety that uncertainty produces allows us to turn to experts. And that's what we concentrate in universities. So I think this is a moment where we need to rise and shine, and in the literal sense of illuminating the path forward. And we do that obviously in the life sciences research. We have groups at our medical school involved in new testing protocols and in vaccine development, as well as some of the clinical trials. We are actually one of the sites for also the phase 1 clinical trials for one of the RNA vaccines that are being tried out. So we're very proud of that role we play. But in addition to, and by the way, some of those are platforms that were developed for other problems. Some of the testing groups, these are people who had been working on testing and drug development around other viral diseases like HIV/AIDS. And although this is a very different virus, of course, but you can use those platforms of knowledge and purpose them for the particular pathogen at hand. And that's why one of the lessons here is you need to keep that capacity, that platform capacity.
Yeah.
Because there will be other pandemics. We just don't know what is going to be the specific pathogen at that point. And you need to be able to actually mobilize that. That is why there's progress on the vaccine development front in particular has been so fast, unprecedentedly fast. It's because we had those platforms, but we need to keep those. But beyond that, on the public health front, you know, universities are providing most of the epidemiological modeling. That's my professional community, I know them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
a lot
right.
of the projections that you see at the White House, everyone using, are coming from universities. In Miami, we are providing for the county all the seroepidemiological surveys that's allowing to do that surveillance to identify hotspots and to measure what's the prevalence of the disease.
Yeah.
And then lastly, we shouldn't forget the social science, the social sciences here, particularly when we deal with the economic consequences of the pandemic, which is another crisis. And that includes, you know, formulating evidence-based policy to deal with mitigation measures in terms of stimulus and compensation for families, etc. And then another thing that Chancellor Johnson mentioned, our research on health disparities, because that is playing out in a magnified way with the pandemic. And by the way, it's not unrelated to your first question, to the structural causes of racism. It gets expressed in the distribution of illness and deaths, which disproportionately is affecting people of color, communities of color. So it's a comprehensive approach to problems that gives universities an incredible edge to help navigate and come out.
These concepts are so important. Convergent research, platform capacity, epidemiological modelings, you know, social science implications, so powerful and important. And yet, most in higher education struggle to build public awareness and sometimes you know, the sort of support of the funding community for this core work. And President Napolitano, you've worked on this for years. What do you think we need to do to build support for the research mission of our great institutions?
Well, you know, these great research universities are foundational to so many things in our country. If, you know, the United States is to continue to lead the world and in innovation, that innovation starts somewhere, and generally it starts in a university laboratory, and in so many different areas. And during the pandemic, it's been great to see the convergence of research on all issues involving the virus, from modeling to testing modalities to development of new therapeutics to the basic science needed to have a vaccine. And some of it was done from schools outside of our medical research establishments. The College of Engineering at Berkeley, for example, figured out how to re-engineer the machines people use when they have sleep apnea to be ventilators, and to help with the ventilator shortage. So there's just so much work there that has a real world impact. And if there's anything that I would emphasize by way of getting the public to appreciate it, is to appreciate the real world impact of the research done at our universities. You know, now there's a new bill. It was just introduced yesterday in the U.S. House of Representatives. It's called the RISE Act. It would provide $26 billion to support the research at our universities and the ramp up of non-COVID-19 research that had to be set aside for purposes of really focusing on the pandemic. And so that bill would be a clear demonstration of at least congressional appreciation of the research function and the criticality of the research functionality at our universities.
Dan,
So
can I follow up on something? Just
Oh,
that,
please do, yes.
if you don't mind, it's something that both President Frenk and President Napolitano said. So I'll start with what President Napolitano said with regard to the bills. I also think leader Senator Chuck Schumer introduced the Endless Frontier with regard to establishing National Science and Technology Foundation. So again, a large investment in research that would greatly impact in a very positive way the university. And the thing that I loved about what you both said is this, and Dan, you commented on it too, it's this platform capacity. So in my field, when I was an engineer a long time ago, I was the last class to take power electronics. You know, motors, generators, you know, it just was kind of, it was analog, it was going out, digital was the hot thing, VLSI. So what's one of the hottest things right now in electrical engineering? It's power electronics for electric vehicles or renewable energy. So what's nice is that the researchers continued to work, and then they integrated their knowledge into other courses to complement it, so we never lost it. That was that capacity that we have. Maybe it was a little dormant, but the universities, because I think President Sexton said this, out of the roughly 80 or 90 institutions in the world that are older than 1,000 years, 77 are universities. And it's because of that continuum, that knowledge, that continue to push and preserve knowledge for the next generations, because we don't know when we're going to need it. And I think that's something that the public also would be great for us to be communicating as well.
Well, one of the things that I'd love for us to be able to talk about is the undergraduate mission of your institutions and all of the different needs that today's students are facing. And rather than ask you a direct question about that, because I'd like to get to questions, what I'd like to do is offer a teaser and then go to questions. And the teaser is, could you say in one sentence, what one major change you think we will see in undergraduate education a decade from now, perhaps hastened because of this interlocked set of crises, or perhaps one that was on the way anyway. But if you think about the future of American education, one likely change, a sentence on that, and then we'll open it up to our audience. President Napolitano, can I call on you first?
Hey. Greater integration of online learning into the residential college experience.
Yeah.
Okay. President Frenk?
We're going to move to a more widely distributed educational experience along the entire career path of people, rather than the front-loading model we have now, where we front load education and graduate people, we will have a higher distribution where universities adopt an open architecture and are the providers of evolving educational services to meet the evolving educational needs of people throughout their entire career.
Beautiful. Chancellor Johnston?
I could listen to both of you all day. So the joy of going last is I'm going to combine what you both said. I think we're going to see the hybrid just-in-time learning online that President Napolitano talked, and the lifelong learning that is what I interpreted President Frenk talking about. So I think that just-in-time learning that will be enabled by online education, remote instruction, will be a continuum all through one's life.
Thank you so much. Let's bring Crystal out. And Crystal, what is our audience interested in hearing about?
We have a lot of great questions coming in. The first question we have is for President Napolitano and Chancellor Johnson. How will COVID-19 state budget cuts and congressional aid packages impact your ability to provide quality remote learning and student support next school year?
So I'll start. Look, we're going to have a state budget cut, likely, unless the Congress passes another CARES Act that has aid in it for the states, at which point we may actually see a small increase in our budget. But one of the things that we are investing in and need financial support for is the technology necessary so that all students have the right equipment, so that we can provide hotspots for students who live in areas where they don't have access to Wi-Fi, and to improve and keep improving the platforms that we're using for delivery of our academic content.
Yeah. So I think it's similar at the State University of New York. We estimate that the COVID-19 crisis will be about $1 billion cost to the state, and the budget cuts will depend on whether we are able to receive any resources from the federal government in the next CARES Act, which would be important. So, and that splits along, enrollment potential, cuts to residential halls and loss of room and board, and as well as then state cuts. So I think that we're hopeful that we will receive some of those resources. We started about a year ago investing in the infrastructure that would allow us to put in place an online platform across SUNY, which was helpful. The resources to do that investment is expensive, as President Napolitano alluded to, would be necessary. Rural access to broadband and the internet in some of our rural communities, particularly upstate, would be very important as well. So I think it's very similar challenges that we face as well.
Our next question is, what long-term effects do you think the pandemic will have on non-COVID related research?
I would say that it depends. I'm very heartened by the news that President Napolitano just shared. It doesn't have to be that it affects. I mean, typically when there's been recessions, you have experienced reductions in budgets. But on the other hand, we do know that that after crises like this, and the most dramatic example was what happened after World War II, which really launched the original science, the endless frontier, the Barnard Bush report that led to the NIH and the NSF, and a realization of the centrality of science to actually be able to lead the country and the world out of crisis. So this is a time when societies need to realize the importance of investing in science So it doesn't necessarily have to do that. I think I hope it accelerates that the transition from siloed research to the sort of convergent research that Chancellor Johnson was talking about. Interdisciplinary inquiry that brings the natural sciences, the social sciences, the arts, and the humanities to understand complex problems of humanity. And the pandemic is one such problem. The ensuing economic crisis is another one. The social disruption that we're seeing, all of those require that convergence of different disciplines, and this is the time to enhance those investments.
Does anyone else want to answer that or add it?
Beautifully
I
said.
think Julio said it very well, and we did shut down some of our research labs during the pandemic. We now need to ramp that research back up, get those grad students and postdocs back working in those labs, and at the same time continue the pace of all of the research involved with the virus, with the pandemic. And we can multitask, we can do both. We need some help financially to help get us there.
Great. Our next question is, do students want to be on campus and out of the home? If we must revert to a virtual learning model, is there pressure to reimburse or lower tuition, further stressing higher education's economic model?
That's a lot, but it's good.
I think students really want to come back, and not just students, faculty. We all want to be there back. It's universities do tend to build this sense of community. We have observed, we have not observed a decline in deposits or in interest, actually quite the opposite. But the key here is to assure that we can reopen in a way that guarantees the safety and health of students and also faculty and staff. And so I'm sure that both the University of California and the State University of New York have done the same thing. I mean, very, very detailed plans. Universities have developed incredibly detailed plans to make sure that happens.
Right.
Ours has 4 pillars. One is what everyone is saying: testing, tracing, and tracking, the triple T. Testing is very, very critical here. Number 2 is cleaning and disinfecting, hand hygiene, disinfection. 3, the most important, I think, is protecting personal space, which means wearing face covers and re-engineering every single space, residential facilities, dining facilities, classrooms, to assure safe distance. And the 4th is vaccinating, not against the coronavirus, because I don't think we will have a vaccine quite yet, although I'm very confident we'll have one, but not in the fall, but against the influenza. This is the first time those 2 viruses are going to coexist. And the one vaccine we have, which is against seasonal influenza, we should have everyone have their flu shots. So I think if we do those things and then innovate educationally, use this opportunity to innovate along the lines of what President Napolitano was saying, blending, I think we should be able to provide not just an experience that's similar to what was before, actually something better, and make of the pandemic an incredible learning experience for this generation of students.
I think that very well said again. One of the things that we've done is go back through the departments and look at every class and examine and assess the learning outcomes and find out, there are just some things that need to be taught in a clinical setting, in a laboratory setting, still can be done socially distant, as President Frenk said, with proper personal protective equipment. And then we've learned what could be taught online. And I'm sure, obviously, the President Napolitano and Frenk have recognized this too, is that, the concept of the flipped classroom. So I think you'll see all throughout higher ed changing, where you might have the master lecturer, and you might have very large classes that even go throughout the system in some particular area, but then smaller socially distant discussion, more detailed work going on campus. So I think that may survive beyond COVID-19.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that has become clear is that there is more to the college experience than being online. There is a value in being on campus, to be forming new friendships, to be involved in extracurricular activities, to have kind of those spontaneous discussions with your professor that you really can't match online. And so it's that value that we have to continue to build on as we come back from the pandemic, come back safely with all of the measures that President Frenk and President Johnson have talked about, but recognize the value in that residential experience. Students want to come back. Their parents want their students to come back. So that's something that we should keep in mind.
Can I follow up on what President Napolitano said, if you don't mind? I thought that was very well said. So here's an unexpected, aha moment maybe. And so looking at some of the feedback from professors and the students through pivoting 400,000 students to remote instruction, very interesting. What we're finding is that when you're teaching remotely, the empathy of the faculty member, the instructor, really impacts the learning outcomes. Now you may say, well, but even more so empathy and caring. You have to be more empathetic and more caring. I think that's going to carry back into the in-person classroom. And it was really brought home when we went out and surveyed a lot of our students. And one student wrote this marvelous, really terrific letter to the SUNY faculty. But the classic line, which I'll never forget, was the particular student said, if you're gentle with your questions, we'll be kind with our answers. That was marvelous.
So great. So great. This one is our last question. How will the halting of technological immigration visas impact the educational process and landscape?
Can you repeat that? I'm not sure I heard it.
How will the halting of technological immigration visas impact the educational process and landscape?
Well, I'll start on that one. Look, I think it's certainly not helpful. The United States for decades has been a talent magnet for the world, and our systems of higher education have been talent magnets. And the United States has benefited from that in innumerable ways. Yeah. Cutting off that kind of international aspect and the ability to have students from around the world it doesn't help the United States. I mean, they may say it does, but when you really think about it, it doesn't. So we're quite concerned with some of the recent orders that the administration has issued.
Yeah, I think it's a misguided policy.
I mean, it's not exactly what you're saying, but people very often don't realize that higher education is also a main export. You can actually export services when the consumer of the service, in this case the student, moves to the place. So every time we bring international students, that's a form of export, and it's one of the exports. It's one of the largest service exports in the United States, and it's one that has the most favorable balance of trade, because there's about 1 million students from other countries studying in the United States. The economic benefit is huge, both directly by the fact that they pay typically tuition and help subsidize the tuition for American students. but also all the economic activity that they generate. I mean, it's been estimated to be in the order of $38 billion a year. And then it creates all these goodwill ambassadors. And then many of them, the best of them, actually stay here and become that, fuel that magnet for talent. So one thing we need to realize is the crucial economic value of universities, both to the local communities, by, of course, recruiting and bringing all kinds of students, but in particular, international students actually represent not just a source of diversity, of greater learning. It enriches the experience of American students. It helps pay for some of the American students' education, but it's also has all these other effects. All those graduates have lived in the United States, have known about the advantages, and become the best advocates, the best ambassadors that the US has all over the world. Many of our graduates end up in positions of leadership. They become prime ministers, presidents, CEOs around the world. This is one of the ways the United States is able to influence for the good the rest of the world. So I hope we also see universities in that light.
Great.
Yep.
Any final thoughts, Dan?
Crystal, thank you for organizing this Hearst lecture, and thank you to Chancellor Johnson, President Frenk, and President Napolitano. The three of you have chosen to shoulder absolutely stunning, extraordinary responsibilities, and you do it in a spirit of passion and service for others and for humanity. And we thank you for all you do to make your communities, our country, and the world a better place. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, it was an honor hosting you. And as we adjourn, I just want to thank you all, thank our attendees for tuning in today. All of our community events this summer are free and open to the public. And so we ask that anyone who's in a position to donate, there's a link on our chat to donate to our program. I hope that you all will join us for the rest of our summer series. We have our McCloskey Speaker Series event coming up on July 8th, featuring Ross Douthat of the New York Times, whose new book is out now, entitled The Decadent Society. Thanks to you all for joining us. See you next time.